programming. We've really had wonderful interest in these events, and thanks to everyone who's been to our past events and provided feedback along the way. It's been really helpful for us. And we're hosting these Exploring Ethical Space workshops really so that we can learn together, to help us all better understand Indigenous worldviews and laws, to build relationships, and really to set ourselves up for working together for a better future for all beings. And today we are honored and thrilled to have founding directors of the International Buffalo Relations Institute. And the work of the Buffalo Relations Institute supports the implementation of the Buffalo Treaty, which includes over 43 First Nations and tribes. So we're having a unique conversation today about this treaty as it relates to creating and enacting an ethical space from the mountains to the plains. So this is going to be a free-flowing dialogue today with our special guests, and everyone in the audience, you'll have opportunities to ask questions afterwards. So I think most of us are quite used to Zoom by now, although as we experienced this morning, we still have technical difficulties. But while you, as a guest here, as a participant here, we just ask that you please keep yourself muted unless you're asking a question. We do like to see each other. It's lovely to see all our faces. So please keep your camera on if that suits you. But please do turn your camera on when you're asking a question. So Marie-Ève Marchand is the director of the International Buffalo Relations Institute, and she's going to guide the conversation today. Marie-Ève lives in Banff and successfully coordinated the movement to bring the Plains bison back to Banff National Park, and has been supporting the Buffalo Treaty really since its first signing. And she follows the path of her French-Canadian ancestry by connecting with First Nations and tribes of the Plains, but this time to restore buffalo back to the land and all its relations, instead of taking hides off to the market. So welcome Marie-Ève, and she will welcome our special guests. Thank you.
Okay, bonjour. Hello for everyone to be here. This is a beautiful conversation that, if I may say, I want to root it in a conversation that started in 2013. The staff of the Y2Y, where we're sitting in a meeting in Montana in Big Sky. Leroy was on the panel looking at buffalo and at the American Bison Conservation, and he came, how is Y2Y involved on buffalo? And we're in 2013, so this is like, move forward 9 years later, we're finally having those space of conversation and interaction between how do we connect the large landscape to connect to from the Yellowstone to Yukon, but above and beyond into the east, and all those real connection at the landscape, at the people, and from the air, the land, and the sea. And I love that people started like, please put in the chat where you're from, because I'm seeing people from all over in this list. Welcome to all the government of Alberta, the Parks Canada, all the community signatories to the treaties from the States and Canada are here on both sides of the border. And that's what we will be talking about this space. So I don't want to take too much. I really would like to invite probably Leroy to start the meeting in a good way. And then from there, I will invite each of the speakers, Dr. Tasha Hubbard and Kyra Northwest, to present themselves and to do a welcome. And we'll move into a conversation. So Leroy, may I pass it to you?
To start our meeting, I'll just say a short prayer for putting everybody in good mind. Okay. And you can all join in, each in your own way. Ayos te patapiu pa yunatu siku kumiki sumakakin itas pa pekana suika ekonomian sikakatu siwakak sudumukunan shkatsumatpuan oksisikuikaga kitkunoatua spua hannak nitpuk sa patapiman na nakakonomian speak siwakak hannok sakkuini nitpukita pasiman na nakakyayo Kimatumekakipitsaka tupuawa kipatapiuksiwa. Hai spumukinandaks kitaputatsasauxinnanik. Mukini patapiuxanikak nitqutspennanikak taqutsapauxinnanikak taksistapinnamatskatuussannanik. Kenna kiitsipuutua kohkiimahkutsi. Mahkitsui patapiisikak ja nitqanayohkiwa spinnanakak. Nuuqsi patapiihpinnan kanuatua piwakak. Takai iskskaatsi pinnana motaksai isai pumistutsi pinnanakak. Kennak spumitapiuksah kummitapiwakak spumukinnanakak tsikimmata spinnan. Sistamiapi mistapipuutumukinnan. Kreita miksamstane kanakjahpika pia kumimma pikkinapi. Ahsetapia pia kumimma pi. Takitas pia puauhkah pinnan. Taksukkoksishkatu pinnanakak. Misami päätä piuksen. Na piusni taamistawatsemani kamutaan.
To start, Leroy, would you like to introduce yourself, and then we'll move to Kyra and Tasha and Kyra?
Mistuoda kaukiikaskineva. Inaksiks kainau. Salkitapi. Luhtuutsetapi. My Blackfoot name is Lowhorn. I'm from the Small Ropes clan of Kainau, or sometimes referred to as the Blood Tribe. And we're of the Blackfoot Confederacy. My English name is Leroy Little Bear, and long time associated with University of Lethbridge. I'm presently the president of the International Buffalo Relations Institute.
Hey. Kyra?
Danse Gedamskat Nawao Gakiao. Okisko Squeonatigasan Agamneko Jinia. Good morning, everybody. My Cree name is Okisko Squel, which translates to either like a sky being or spirit woman. I am from the Montana First Nation, which is one of the 4 Musqueam nations in Treaty 6 territory and what is now known as Alberta. So nice to see you all.
And Dr. Tasha Hubbard.
Hi, good morning, good afternoon. Tasha Hubbard. I'm from Papixis First Nation in Treaty 4 with ties through my dad to Thunderchild First Nation in Treaty 6. I'm an associate professor at the University of Alberta, and I'm also a filmmaker, and I'm currently working on my 3rd feature, a film that is called Singing Back the Buffalo. And and heavily involved in support of the Buffalo Treaty and one of the founding directors of EBRI.
And if I may say, Tasha's also did her PhD and her master's degree in thinking about Buffalo and Buffalo relations and calling in that space of ethical space. So we have one of the most experts in North America in this with us. I'm really glad you're there, Tasha. And I think to start the meeting, I would like to share 4-minute videos on the origin of the Buffalo Treaty that we all know what it means when we're talking and where it started, and then move into your conversation. So if anyone has problem with the video that I'm sharing for sounds, because I know there's different bandwidth, you can always go to buffalotreaty.com on their stories and find the video, but I will try to share and hope it all works for everyone here.
The Buffalo Treaty came about as a result of elders in my territory in Blackfoot country being concerned about the loss of meaning of our culture to the younger generation. To put it simply, they basically said, the buffalo is out of sight, out of mind. We need to have our young people see that buffalo on a daily basis to make the connections of our culture to that very keystone animal. So it was that concern that resulted in what we called buffalo dialogues. And those buffalo dialogues resulted in bringing grassroots people, from young people to elders. And we talked around in our tables and so on, told stories about the buffalo. The elders said, I think we're now all of one mind. We need to bring our people together and work on having the buffalo come back to our territory. But we cannot do this alone, because bringing the buffalo back is a big job. We need the assistance of our brothers and sisters, our neighbors to the south. And to our surprise, everybody was of the same mind. And so our elders said, the best road to bring in all of our people together is to sign a Buffalo Treaty, so that we will all work together again as nations. We used to trade, we used to come in through people's territories and so on. And so it was trying to revive those ideas. But it wasn't just about the revival of those. It was reviving the land again. It seemed that the land was also missing the presence of the buffalo. The buffalo is a very good environmentalist. The Buffalo Treaty speaks to conservation. Let's all work together on conservation. The Buffalo Treaty speaks to education. Let's use the buffalo as the portal for bringing our children together to learn about their culture, the land, the environment, the cosmos, and so on. Let's use the buffalo for, teaching our children our ceremonies, our stories, and our songs. Let's talk about health, okay, amongst our signatories to the treaty. And hey, each of us are also doing research. Let's all work together on research projects in these areas: conservation, climate change, environmental issues, education, health. Hey, that buffalo is in the center, and it's bringing us all together.
Hey, I hope everyone was able to watch it. And there's more Buffalo Treaty stories and different, that if you were really go on the website, there's a digital stories of telling. And Kyra and Tasha, I want to be in the back seat, so it's a really conversation, feel free. But let's start with treaty and treaty enactment. And what is the difference? And I will invite Leroy to start between the Buffalo Treaty and treaty with the Crowns. And what is the difference when we do a Buffalo Treaty? Let's create a base of understanding what it is, because they're not the same. And we haven't, some of the people, if we're talking creating that safe space of sharing knowledge. And so can we start about what is the Buffalo Treaty and the difference with the treaty with the Crowns, and how does it fit in the implementation of UNDRIPS, or the UN Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples in Canada? Leroy, I would like to start that part of the conversation to create a good base of understanding for all the over 200 people who are listening today.
Yeah, thanks very much, Maria. But firstly, since this gathering, if I can put it that way, is really about this notion of ethical space, let me just say a few words about ethical space so that people really have a good idea about what ethical space is all about, how my friend Willie Ermine really meant by ethical space. And let me put it, I think it's best understood in terms of negotiations. And let me put it in those terms, in that context. So picture yourself sitting on one side of the table, and I'm sitting on the other side of the table. And you bring in all your background, your biases, your beliefs, and so on with you. And what might have happened to you yesterday and this morning, in other words, you might have been kicked out of bed and so on, pushed out the door, etc. All of those kind of things you might be sitting at that table with, okay? And the same thing on my side of the table, okay? And in other words, that's what I'm coming to the table with. That's what you're coming to the table with. And in many, many cases, all those biases, beliefs, and so on, vested interests that we may have in existing systems, get in the way of true negotiations. In other words, we don't listen to each other. We end up taking those and we put them in front of us, and they become hurdles that we have to overcome. So the notion of ethical space is really saying, let's take all of those hurdles and put them aside. Let's leave them at the door so that when we come to negotiate, we have a neutral space that we can speak from on both sides, your side and my side, so that all those biases and beliefs and so forth, are not getting in the way. That's what ethical space is all about. So when we think about that notion of ethical space and we come to treaties, okay, let's take existing treaties with the Crown, okay? Ethical space was, the Crown had certain ideas about what they wanted to accomplish. At the time of the numbered treaties, for instance, in Canada, hey, the Crown, the Prime Minister of the day, John A. Macdonald, had a national plan. And I won't go into the national plan, but part of it was to settle the West and bring settlers from down east and so on, and get the Indians out of the way, put them on reserves. All those were part of the national plan, see? And that was what he was bringing to the table, in other words, see? And whereas the Indians were saying, hey, this is all about peace. This is all about sharing and so on. That's what they were bringing to the table. And so when we're talking through ethical space, they weren't really talking about the same thing. See? So when we come to the Buffalo Treaty, everybody's talking about the same thing. Everybody's saying, hey, when we really look at it, it's really about our cultural survival. It's really about us and the continuation, the continuity of our ways of life into the future. But for that continuity to be in place, the land has to also be part of it. We have to be part of that land. And who can help us do that? Well, the buffalo can help us do it. It can help the land bring back the land to what it used to be, bring about that bio, harmony that used to exist before agriculture kind of totally changed the landscape on the plains. Let's see if we can try and bring at least some of that back and so on. And culturally, hey, we can bring back that buffalo and strengthen so that when we're singing those songs, when we're telling those stories, doing those ceremonies, our young people will really know what it's all about if they were to look out and see buffalo out there. That's, in other words, the Buffalo Treaty was one where everybody was all of one mind. And it's on that basis, ethical space was not a problem because everybody was thinking the same way. Let me leave it at that for now.
Kind of feeling, Tasha, you want to add a bit of a context? And you're on mute, so you'll have to.
Always the mute. Yeah, thank you for that, Leroy. And I'm really glad you started with that, with Willie Ermine's notion of ethical space. And it's something that I think, has guided the work that we do together and guided the work around the Buffalo and Buffalo Treaty. I just want to give a little bit of background to, my approach and the work I do. And as Mary-Eve noted, my academic work has been around buffalo and in particular, buffalo stories and Indigenous creative projects around the buffalo and what those stories and what that work teaches us. The work I tend to put out into the world is film and nature. And, a lot of my films prior to Singing Back the Buffalo have been ones that really delve into, the historical and contemporary colonial violence against Indigenous people. And really, what I work towards and what my motivation is really around the notion of justice and Indigenous justice. However, because of the work I've done with the buffalo, it's really about a justice that includes more than human beings. And so, with that as a framework, if we think about, relationality, which really means, shared reciprocity, shared obligations that, Indigenous peoples have, that our stories teach us. And within that sphere, those obligations and responsibilities to the more than human beings. And, for me, being from the prairies, I think about, who is within these prairie ecosystems, and the buffalo being that primary focus. And so really, I think about and write about and make films about that, if we're going to have that notion of justice, if we're going to have that notion of ethics, that it necessarily includes those multitudes of beings who have their own personhood in our thought. We've been very influenced by colonial thought, where human centrism, has been really implemented. And my work thinks about how to move back into a space where you know, we're not so focused with humans as the, you know, the top of the hierarchy or the humans at the center of the web, but in fact, you know, it's a shared space where we all have our rights and we all have our responsibilities, human beings and the more than human beings. And so, you know, what does that mean for the buffalo, you know, to be recognized, and for the buffalo to have justice, for the buffalo to have body sovereignty, for the buffalo to have the freedom to move? And, you know, one of the things that, you know, we think about and talk about is that, you know, we talk about Indigenous territory, and this is our Indigenous territory. It's the buffalo's territory just as much as it's our territory. And so, you know, those are, you know, those are things I think about. And I just want to say, you know, I really, you know, want to think about this notion of ethics, that, you know, in the work that, and, you know, I'm looking at the list of participants here, and I think everybody's, you know, doing really amazing work. And I think it is a good framework for us to grapple with today, is really what that means to create space where, you know, Indigenous knowledges, Indigenous experiences are honored and respected, you know, as we do the work that we do, you know, on our individual paths. So I have more to say, but I'll maybe just stop there for now.
And Kyra, would you like to add some kind of opening remarks without being, but if not, well, I'll have a few questions to direct, but I would like to create this space for you.
Yeah, for sure. I think that all of us that work with the Buffalo Treaty and within the nations that are signatories of the Buffalo Treaty, we have this understanding of ethical space as already, because I think as Indigenous peoples, we had processes that had to deal with ethics and how knowledge was shared, how land was shared, how we had these relationships beyond just ourselves, like Tasha had said. And when the treaty was starting to get signed, and we were talking about who would be signing the treaty and having it between sovereign nations, I think that there was already that mutual understanding of what that meant. We had treaties that were existing pre-colonialism, signing treaties with the Crown. We had those relationships and those treaties already between ourselves as nations. And I think that when we had those treaties, it wasn't always something that was signed on a piece of paper. It was things that were done through ceremony. It was things that were done through different activities that we did together. And we also had shared just areas and spaces on the land where those treaties were enacted, places like Cypress Hills, places where we had peace treaties, just because we knew the significance of those places. And in those places too, they had to do with the types of activities we did there. And specifically in Cypress Hills was because there was an abundance of buffalo. We had those peace treaties because we knew that that was such a significant resource that we had to share amongst ourselves. So we knew the importance of that animal and that species to ourselves, as we could say Cree people, Blackfoot people across the prairies. So these things already pre-existed. And I think that enacting the Buffalo Treaty and re-establishing those relationships between ourselves as Indigenous nations, and then also re-establishing that relationship with the buffalo, has been something that has been very significant. And I think that advancing that work and still creating those spaces and creating those conversations on what does that mean in restoring relationships that might have been disrupted or broken for some time.
Right, Tasha, you want to add something to that? If not, I'll bring the conversation a little bit on the, but do you want to add something, Tasha?
Yeah, I think, Kyra brings up a really, really important point, and that, because of colonial policies, I think, and Leroy talks about how our knowledges and how our approaches have often been this silo approach, right? Where we each have our tiny spaces, and in reality, there are these relationships that exist within ourselves as Indigenous people, within our nations that predate the number treaties. We had other treaties that we had amongst ourselves in order to continually, basically live well, right? To have the resources we need, to have the, for our children to have good life. I mean, all of this was focused on that. And, one of the things that, the stories tell us is that we learned that model of, relationality, of living well together, of, balance from the buffalo, and some of my early work was, I would hear a lot about, education is the new buffalo. And it always just didn't quite resonate with me. And I started to really think about what does that exactly mean? And the implication for the most part is that it's Western education, it's universities. And of course I'm function in that university space, but it's very limited. It's actually really limited. And so, what does it mean to think about that? And then I started to think, well, but actually the stories tell us and teach us that, it's the buffalo that is one of our teachers, and the buffalo is our education. And how do we, what do we learn from them? And we, through the, my work and through the film, we've been really privileged to spend time with herds, to watch them. And, I want to acknowledge Wes Olson, who was the first person to take me out and, actually walk the land to go and see the buffalo. And we would walk miles and miles and miles to do so, which is part of that, for me, it was a way of reconnecting and getting to know our territory again. That the buffalo have systems of care within. They have systems of protection. They have obligations to each other that they continually enact, and really out of a place of love. And I'll just share a little story that, we were filming a herd this summer, and they had a new calf. It was a he. It was just a week old, still orange. The others were more grown and more brown. And, it was just inherently curious about us and our crew. And it came up quite close. Like, we don't approach the herd, we go, and if the herd decides to approach us, great. And that's been happening quite a bit. So this beautiful little calf is coming. Everyone's aware we're there, of course, they're watching. And at some point the bull decides, this is enough. I'm going to step in. And it wasn't an aggressive move. It was very much a protective move, and just a signal to us that, he knows we're probably not a harm, but at the same time, letting us know, who's in charge here, or who's going to step up and protect. And, it was such a beautiful lesson, because we're like, yeah, it's time for us to back off, right? And it made me really think about us as human beings and how we impose ourselves, through that colonial model on land, and how human beings have changed the land so much. And it's like the buffalo in that moment was like, this is our space, this is our territory, we're letting you be here, but you have to follow a certain guideline. And we acknowledged that and respected that, and went, yeah, well, we're going to back up now and go back to the car. And so I just, I think that for those unfamiliar with the Buffalo Treaty, going into that and seeing in the way that it encourages that remembrance that, we all need to find a way to live well together. The buffalo can once again be our teacher in that, and to think beyond these imposed borders that have been put on us, and the confinement that we've all experienced as Indigenous peoples. The buffalo can be our teacher to think beyond the metaphorical restrictions to a much more expansive way of looking at the world that we live in, looking at the ecosystems that we are a part of, and rather than imposing, what are our responsibilities to the health of that space?
Let me throw in a couple things for our listeners to really think about. When we're talking about the buffalo as an eco-engineer, as a bioengineer, and so on. We, scientists study all different animals, and they talk about the ecological role of these animals. We've got a plethora of studies about the ecological roles of different animals. But there's no studies about the ecological role of human beings. Now, what's our ecological role on this earth? And secondly, just to use as an example, if you live in the city, of course, we all want to have nice green lawns, and we ferociously attack those dandelions that we see as invasive, as an invasive species that come on and grow on our lawns. Well, according to scientists, we originated in Africa. Okay, we're natural to Africa, but we're all over the world today. Should we not look at ourselves as an invasive species? And what are all the implications and ramifications of us being an invasive species? So when we're talking about let's bring back the buffalo, let's let it be, let's allow it to do its thing so that the land can be rejuvenated and in fact contribute to things that governments are concerned about, such as climate change. Hey, those things will happen, see. But we're not really talking about our role as an invasive species and what our ecological role in that total picture, see. And, these are the kind of things that we should be reflecting on. The Buffalo Treaty assists us to think about these kind of things. So it's not just about Indigenous people. The Indigenous people, by signing that Buffalo Treaty, are thinking much beyond that. In fact, they're thinking about the continuity of humans into the future. That's what really the Buffalo Treaty is about.
And that's really important, Leroy, and maybe I hope everyone understands what a keystone species or landscape engineer the bison here, but it's really important as we understand relations and that Tasha was talking with the land, that we have all the players with us if we want to succeed in facing those biodiversity, climate inequity. We're really like those, we really need help. And I know, Leroy, you talk a lot about it too, as like, why is the buffalo such a keystone spacing and engineer in this landscape? And you have good metaphors with sports that maybe you could bring the audience and all of us in this conversation.
Well, we were just talking to another audience not too long ago over in Toronto. And they were talking about us all working together. And they talked about this coming together in terms of let's all take flight together, okay? And what we told them was, hey, you know, in Blackfoot, we have a word and we have a description, actually, not a word, but a description. And the description is Matsiputan. And Matsiputan really refers to flight in beauty, okay? And what it brought to me and what it reminds me is seeing geese flying by in flight formation and their V-shaped formation and so on. And even in flight, they're working together. And if you study them and really look at them, hey, it makes it easier for them to fly, you know, because as I was explaining, as one bird's wings flap up, the one behind's the bird behind's wings is flapping down and so on. That makes it much easier to fly and so on. In other words, the air waves and so on makes it much easier, except for the leader. And every once in a while, they have to change leaders. You'll see them change leaders so that the existing leader can take a rest, so to speak, and so on. Well, that kind of cooperation is the kind of thing that the buffalo, when we say the buffalo is the portal, you know, it's the portal through which we can work together, you know, work not separately. We humans, we're not separate. Work together with the buffalo to bring about those conditions that'll make for continuing existence, say, and balance and so on. Because if we keep going the way we're going, in other words, very short-term goals and so on, very short-term gains, etc., that's where the imbalance occurs. And all we have to do is look around where we're at. And our existing systems are starting to implode, from government to economic systems. They're all starting to implode because they can't be sustained, you know, because everybody's doing their own thing. We're not cooperating, say. And that's the kind of thing that we can learn from nature. And the buffalo, as a keystone species, is an animal, is a brother, is a relative that we can learn from. We talk about elders. Well, the buffalo is one of our elders. And why is it an elder? Well, because we human beings, according to the scientists, say we came into existence about 200,000 years ago. Bovine animals came into existence about 15 million years ago. So the bovine animals, like the buffalo, have 15 million years of memory that they can draw on. We've only got 200,000 years. So we better listen to those elders. We better listen to the fish. The fish has got 450 million years of memory it can draw on. See, that's the kind of teachings that our elders are saying, hey, work with the buffalo because it can teach us things. See? So that's why the buffalo is a very precious relative. We need to build that relationship with it.
I just want to add another story to that. And, you know, one of the things we were able to do is film. So the Elk Island National Park has their herd, and it's a significant herd, and we you know, feel a connection to it. But the origins of that herd were that calves were taken from Blackfeet territory and into the mountains and cared for by the Salish Kootenai, and then eventually sold to the Canadian government and ended up in Elk Island. And so in 2016, 87 calves were transported back to Blackfeet territory. And so my crew and I were able to film. And we, you know, filmed them from their park. I actually noticed the yearlings. I noticed their families were waiting, because I think the families thought, oh, they're just getting looked at and they'll come back, but they didn't, which made me really think about those family connections, and that, you know, that there's grief, I think, that happens when those yearlings are taken that I don't know is necessarily thought about. But at the same time, buffalo don't have freedom of movement, and so these transfers are necessary, you know, to bring buffalo into other spaces. So they go across, they're welcomed. It's actually the inspiration for the title of the film. They were sang to. There was so much joy in having them come back to that territory. We went back, I think, 3 times to film the moment when they were actually out of quarantine and able to be out on the land. And, you know, we have beautiful footage of them coming off the truck and going to the high point, which is what they do when they get released. They go to the high point so they can look around and see where they are. And the land that they were on is beautiful, healthy grassland, but there was a row of trees along the fence. And because those buffalo came from Elk Island, that's where they went. They went up, looked up around, and then they went to the trees. And, you know, they were all yearlings. There's no adults to you know, help them along. And the person who was caring for them said to me, I don't understand why they're in the trees. Like, why are there's this beautiful, healthy grassland? Why are they not there? And I said, well, because they're going to what they know, right? They know that the trees for them are, you know, what they've learned is a safe space, and they'll figure it out, you know, they'll figure it. And I said, please tell me, you know, when they come out and when they go, when their memories kick in and they're like, oh, right. Because it's not just their lived memory, it's their genetic memory, it's their blood memory that they have. And it's, as Leroy said, they've been here for so long, it kicks in. So it did, you know, 2 weeks later, they were out. And, you know, we talked about how, you know, we can understand ourselves in the same way, in the sense of, you know, we've been removed, you know, our residential schools, child welfare, all of these systems that have taken us from our families and for much more nefarious reasons than trying to restore. But, you know, when he said that, he said, they're out already. And I said, yeah, because they recover faster than we do. You know, we take longer because we're not as knowledgeable as they are, right? You know, and that's what our stories tell us, is to, you know, to remove this, like I say, I use the word human supremacist, human centric, whatever we want to call it. You know, we have to start to think about our humility as human beings. You know, and, you know, the current society we live on is like control, manage, you know, power, all of these things, all of these concepts and things that people live by. But you know, to think about our humility, to think about, you know, that there are these beings, as Leroy said, who are our grandfathers, who we learn from, who, you know, who recover faster, who remember faster, you know, and you know, who quickly move to restore their structure of governance, and who's going to lead them. Yeah.
I just kind of had a couple of thoughts on some of the conversations and things that we've been speaking about, but I think just the idea of ethical space, but also thinking about creating ethical space on the land. So having physical ethical spaces where these types of conversations happen, or where these relationships are starting to be rebuilt and restructured. I think as Indigenous people and people in conservation and settlers, that land is a part of our collective identity. It's been a big discussion and a big kind of, I think, as thinking about treaties has been a big part of that, and talking about land and talking about space. But when we're thinking about some of these places and some of these relationships, it's that those responsibilities that we have, and those responsibilities that we have as stewards of the land. And I think that thinking about physical ethical spaces is that there needs to be a creation for more places where we can actually do those things and rebuild those relationships, where people and animals and plants and everything all belong, and where we're all inclusive of everybody, including other species, obviously. So I think that respecting those roles and those responsibilities that we have to each other, it's something that I've been thinking about in terms of like displacement and not having opportunities to go to these places. Through the work that we've done, we've been able to do hikes to visit the buffalo in Banff National Park. And I don't think that without creating good relationships with people in parks, people that have access to these places, we wouldn't have the opportunities to do those types of things. And I think that it's super rare to be able to go to a place and spend time with animals such as the buffalo and just be able to watch them and see how they live their life, and how that's reflective of some of the values that we have as Indigenous peoples. And it's rare to be able to be in those spaces with those types of species, and it's kind of few and far between that we have the opportunity to do that. And I think as an Indigenous person, growing up, I always had stories of the buffalo. I always knew about them in ceremonies and the significance that they had, but I never was able to see them on the landscape. There was not that opportunity for me as a young person and as a young Indigenous person to see them. I would only be able to see them in a zoo or at a park, and not be able to spend that time with them on the landscape. And I think that that's kind of those ideas of creating that physical ethical space on the ground where those types of relationships can happen, and those types of I guess places where we feel safe in doing so too. I think that has been very important, and something that has been really significant to the work that we're doing, and something that has been staying with me and in the work that we do, for sure.
Kyra, as we're slowly moving to wrap up with questions, I want to bring back to the theme, the mountains to the plains. And you have this Yellowstone to the Yukon connection corridor that's amazing, connecting that old people trails in the south. But we forget sometimes how it extends to the east, and both for the buffalo, but for the people, how we confined in specific spaces and disconnected those landscapes. And it's one of those weirdest things when you stand just on the edge of the eastern slope, one side is really well protected and one is kind of really destroyed and confined and shallow. And we need to work at bringing it together. The water flows, those fishes, those birds, and I think the buffalo can be. And if anyone has any thought as we move to question about this connectivity and deconfining the mountains and the plains and being two different landscapes and not a continuous one that keeps going.
Yeah, that's a really interesting and important point, because we moved within those landscapes back and forth. We had cycles, right? And, in the work I do at the university, some of the stuff I do is around stereotypes, and the stereotype of the Indigenous person wandering aimlessly around, like we were lost all of the time and just grappling for survival is just so ingrained. When in reality, we knew our lands and we knew each other's lands, and we had songs to ask, can we come into this land, you know, because we knew the time of the year where we needed to be to gather the things that we needed for our well-being. And, you know, the mountains and the plains, it goes back to, you know, listening and learning from Leroy over the years. And, you know, like we have to get out of this idea of silo. You know, I really think that that's the case there is, you know, these ecosystems don't exist in, you know, with fences and whatnot. We have such, you know, colonial thinking, so boundaries and borders and fences and who gets to be in what space, as Kyra talked about. You know, I think there is that connectivity. And, you know, I think us getting past that notion into a sense of, you know, and that's where I guess, you know, for those people working in you know, in conservation, in education, in sciences, to really, you know, think about how Indigenous people are involved. And I think, you know, we're coming out of this era of consultation. And, you know, I'm always like, well, what does that really mean? And I always think, yeah, you can consult and then go, oh, I don't want to listen to that, and go back to what you've always done because it's more comfortable, right? And so how do we kind of move into an era of, you know, of ethical space, of involvement, of Indigenous-led, of, you know, of people who have held these spaces of influence for so long, get comfortable with the idea of, you know, maybe I'm going to step this way, maybe I'm going to step back, you know, and really provide space for Indigenous people who, you know, have been thinking about these things and who are, you know, who are knowledgeable about this, you know, to really take that. So kind of pulled it a little bit away, but just, you know, I think it is really important to think, you know, to go to us. We know, we, you know, I to this day, our people know what time of year they need to go to certain places. And it's a challenge, you know, we're seeing the increase of trespass laws. We're seeing an increase of restriction in certain places. And I think it's really important for those that have the ability to open up those spaces for us do so. And the buffalo too.
Yeah, we'll move to questions. There's quite a few already before we close. Yeah, how do we become buffalo friendly? Be friendly with friends between ourselves and with the buffalo and the landscape. Dinah, if you had a question that you wanted to ask, you direct message me.
Hi, hello. Hi, Tansy. I just wanted to ask Leroy if a question. So, and my question is, given that from an Indigenous perspective, we're all connected and equal, and all the nations are coming together to make these change that allows us to preserve our culture and the earth as Indigenous people. I'm wondering what the reason that the Métis Nation of Alberta has not signed the treaty is. Have they been invited to sign the treaty? And if not, like what would it take for them, for everyone to be able to come together? Because that, you know, that's another hurdle. And as Leroy mentioned, you know, the more of us that come together, the bigger the change we can make is, right? So yeah, that's essentially my question.
Well, yeah. Firstly, when we're talking treaty, if treaties are signed by sovereign bodies, okay? So sovereign entities are the ones sign treaties, okay? Now, organizations are not sovereign bodies. They exist as a result of a sovereign above them. Okay, so most of the Métis, as they've organized themselves, have organized themselves as organizations. Okay, now we welcome the the signatories to the treaty welcome organizations, NGOs to sign the treaty. They can sign the treaty as supporters of the treaty. But it's a different matter if they were to come forward and say, we are a sovereign entity.
And what is the discrepancy because of this? Is this because of the mix with the European or past relations, or like what? I guess what do you mean by sovereign nation? Well,
it's up to them. It's up to them how they decide to define themselves. Okay, Blackfoot Confederacy, we've defined ourselves and say this is who we are. Okay, a sovereign entity is basically a statement, a declaration that says that does two things or so. A sovereign entity is basically a notice to the international community, to other sovereigns, that says, hey, we exist, and so on, and we're worthy of notice, and so on, okay? So we're serving you notice, okay? Now, whether those sovereign entities, say we recognize you or not, that's up to, so that, for instance, the international world for the longest time did not recognize China. See, didn't recognize China, but that didn't matter, And eventually they even say, oh, we have to begrudgingly recognize China. Okay, so, but it's a statement by a society that says, hey, we exist, and so on, as a people, and so on. Okay. The second part of it is more or less an agreement within that says, we as a society, this is how we are going to run our show. See, this is how we're going to run our show. And this is how we're going to run our affairs culturally, governmentally, etc.
Right. Well, I mean, they are in the process. There's actually a vote for self-government within the Métis Nation that's taking place on November 5th. So, I mean,
I just want to say here, just for the respect of all the other audience, Daniel, you touch a point that's really important of all the relations with the buffalo and the media. It's something that we talk about and I would encourage you to keep reaching out. Like, let's have another conversation aside, because it might not be other people on the audience fully. There's other list of questions I got, but it is something that's same in Saskatchewan, saying at the end is all those relations with the buffalo and the relation, and there's been talk, and we're like, but it hasn't come together, and it needs to be kept going. So I fully encourage you, where you're touching. I just want to be respectful for everyone else who has different.
Okay, no problem. Thank you.
One, and let's keep, like, seriously, reach out, because we want to keep talking, and we know that there's a conversation to keep having, especially around the buffalo and all this.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much. I just don't want to, but yeah, just to be respectful of everyone's. And I have a question here. I'm just gonna, sorry, I'm trying to find it.
Yeah, and I just for others who may have questions, you can raise your hand in Zoom by using the reactions tab at the bottom, and we do ask you that you we prefer you to ask your question verbally and raise your hand and turn your video on. But if you want to use the chat, we can as well. You must be getting these Marie-Ève direct message. Okay, so you have one. You have a question. Go for it.
I have a question, and the person would rather that I read it. So when harm has been experienced while in ethical space processes and while being in relationship, how are the teaching of the buffalo enacted and reflected to support the healing? And that's a big question that might be like Tasha, you might be Peace, and Leroy. But when harm is being done in those spaces, how do you do, and what are the buffalo can help us learn from to support some healing?
I'll let Tasha take a run at it and I'll add. Yeah.
Yeah. So sorry, just so I understand, when harm has been done within a space.
Yeah, within a space, and is there?
Well, if it's ethical space, then the harm hasn't been done. So I would just say, you know, but yeah, if there's been harm done in a particular space, what does the buffalo teach us in terms of, you know, restoration of justice? Is that really the heart of it? Okay. Yeah. So, you know, well, first of all, you know, I think buffalo are the teachers of that, right? They have their roles. They're matriarchal, you know, again, the colonial imagination is like, oh, the buffalo bull is the big leader. I mean, they're protectors, absolutely. But the grandmothers are the leaders of the community. And within that space, the grandmothers determine, you know, the needs of the herd. The lead grandmother and her sisters and their children then learn from their mothers and grandmothers to be leaders. And so we have this sort of hereditary, you know, system that comes from, you know, wisdom, that comes from knowledge, that comes from not only care for one's own, but care for the collective. And so, you know, I think that's where, when we get out of that kind of a model, and it's very individualized, it's individual benefit, you know, and I guess that's a space where harm and injustice comes. You know, I've asked people in my life, you know, what does it mean for justice? What does that mean to have that? And at the heart of it, it's respect. And I think if we're going to, you know, the buffalo respect each other, the buffalo respect, you know, and you know, there's, you know, autonomy within that as well, that buffalo are free to leave too, if they want, you know, and sometimes bulls just go, you know what, this really isn't, you know, a lot of these are my relatives, and, you know, I don't know if this is where I need to be. I'm going to go somewhere. And then there's you know, the way of integrating into other spaces, and, you know, there's autonomy, but at the heart of it, it's respect. So I would say that, you know, that there, you know, and in that, it means being respectful listeners, having reparation, having reorganizing into a different model, you know, learning more about what that means to have ethical space where there is that. And, you know, I was thinking of doing a little bit of research, and I found a young Métis Dene woman named Chloe Dragon Smith, and I don't know her, just been reading her stuff. And, you know, she talks about her interpretation of ethical space after learning from Willie and others is to create space for different worldviews to come together where both are respected and honored in parallel. And, you know, I think that the buffalo does that, and it's up to us to learn that and relearn that.
Yeah. The whole notion is that tight organization with boundaries and so on, hierarchies, etc., have been associated with European civilizations. And of course, along with that is the notion of wealth, and wealth being translated into power. Okay, so that's European culture. Okay, Indigenous culture is really about freedom. It's freedom. So when you come back over to this culture, the European culture, with the organization, the hierarchies built on wealth and so on, that's where issues of equality, inequity, all those kind of issues come up. Okay. That never comes up in the Indigenous culture because it's about freedom and wealth and so on, possessions, etc., are not translated into power. So those are very different approaches to what we would, what we would call culture. And consequently, that's what, and it's based on what the buffalo does. It's what the beaver does. It's what the fish does. So that's why it's a very good system. And consequently, Europeans, when they first came, they said, hey, those Indians over here don't have courts. They don't have no land ownership system and so on. See, well, we didn't have to have those strict, we didn't have to put up fences, to talk about property notions, etc., which is, you can't get away from it in the European system, see. And because we didn't have fences over here, they thought we didn't have no notions about, land and property and so on, and that we just roamed aimlessly around the plains and so on, but it was a total misunderstanding about what it was all about, So now ethical space, and I want to put my hand up to Y2Y, putting on this discussion, so that we can come together and better understand each other.
Oh, we're so very thankful and grateful to you, the stories and the insights and just these reflections on being human. Thank you. Yeah, I'm just scanning the chat and to see if there are any raised hands, or Marie-Ève, if you have received any more questions. I think we have time maybe for one more question.
I do not have any more, but I know that Kyra took our mic, and maybe we can do a kind of closing. So how do we move forward, like as a question in this landscape? And I will start with Kyra because she had her mics out and she was smiling.
No, I think that just thinking about having these conversations around ethical space and what they mean, like I agree with Tasha that if there's this space that's created, that there would be no harm done and there wouldn't be those types of instances. And I think that with Indigenous ways of knowing and understanding, that we had mechanisms in place that those types of things wouldn't happen, because you'd had that understanding and those responsibilities to each other and to knowledge being shared, and kind of how that knowledge is held and upheld. So I think that that's definitely, I feel the same way. And I think moving forward, having these types of conversations and these understandings of each other is going to be important on how, how to move forward. And it's really important that we build those relationships, because then we have a form of relational accountability to each other, and that there's that accountability to knowing each other, to knowing the landscape that we're on, that the land that we're on, and that we're honoring those relationships that we build. And when it comes down to it, when we talk about ethical space, that's what I think it is. It's building those relationships and having those conversations and taking that time to get to know each other. And that could be, and when I think about knowledge sharing in Indigenous communities and nations, it's done through stories, it's done through songs, it's done through feasting and having meals with each other. So I think there's different ways that we can be doing this and sharing information, sharing knowledge, and then also including our other relatives, such as animals and birds and fish and plants in that ethical space as well, and kind of not just seeing it as ethical space between humans and not, and also obviously including the land too. So I think that that's something that I think is something we have to think about when we're moving forward, is who else are we including in this ethical space? Where else are we creating those spaces?
I think that's a really important, because we keep forgetting about that. Tasha, you want to add something?
Yeah, no, I just think, you know, there's a notion of, you know, I guess listening. I think that there's reflection that's needed. I think that, you know, you know, as we sort of collectively try to work, you know, to making that shift into ethical space, into justice, you know, it's awarenesses, it's learning, you know, it's having love and patience. I think that, you know, for Indigenous peoples, you know, we know the history. We've been, you know, assaulted and oppressed, and yet, you know, we do have this knowledge. We do have these stories, and you know, some of us are in a process of recovery of that as well. And you know, sometimes space is needed to kind of work through that and give us time to just as the buffalo had time to relearn, oh, okay, here I am on the grasslands, and yes, I'm, you know, I can leave the trees and be out there. In this time, you know, I have this, you know, I can make this place my home and move in back and forth. We're in the process of doing that too. You know, and the buffalo remain our teachers in that, just as they were our teachers, you know, long ago. They remain so. You know, as we are, you know, pulling ourselves away from those influences that were pushed on us, you know, they become that center for us to reconnect, which is why Leroy's concept of buffalo consciousness is so important. That it is seeing buffalo, it is engaging, it's observing, it's going back to those systems of education that come from having the ability to be with them. And that's why these buffalo restoration efforts are so important, so that we have that space to learn once again.
Let me, my closing remarks is more like a challenge, and that is, we know how Westerners think because I speak your language. We know how you think, but you don't know how we think because you don't speak Blackfoot. You don't speak Cree. You don't speak Anishinaabe. You don't speak all these Indigenous languages. So my challenge to you is learn those languages, then you'll begin to understand what we're talking about. You'll begin to understand our world. So it's a challenge to you to speak and learn an Indigenous language. That'll be the only way you'll really understand what our world really is all about. The challenge to you.
Challenge accepted, because I think it's really important as we conclude. I'll just put there, the Buffalo Treaty is really, as we move forward, and I'm just going to we talk a lot about truth and reconciliation, but it's not about for Indigenous people to do more of what we want. It's really for the first time to say, hey, this is something that is by sovereign nations together wants to. Are we, for once, have the humility to come into a space as this ethical space that it's not the space we created? Are we able to be partners and supporters, or the intent of that invitation to relations to change the ways we see? And language is key. Language brings in your mind different ways of looking at things, because actually it creates connection. English is a very noun and verb and really strange language that doesn't always define everything that exists. It's just a way of saying, and that's what the language. And I invite everyone to read the Buffalo Treaty, bring it to the places, have conversation, because actually this is an invitation today to come to that space. As we're creating a call space, are you able to come? Are you able to become in an humble way, coming into a space that has defined our past, but might change our future? And that's what the Buffalo Treaty is all about. So I want to say thank you to Dr. Tasha, Hubbard, to Kyra, Northwest, to Dr. Leroy Little Bear, my dear Buffalo family, that we all work together, and many others of signatories of the nations who's been attending today's. There's been many representatives from all across what I call the heart of North America. Can we hear that beat again? Can we hear that beat with the buffalo? That's really what we're talking about. Changing from here to getting back to that land and that vibration. And there's beautiful people in this all across that attended. Thank you. Thank you for Y2Y for hosting this conversation, because it is a leap at looking eastward of the region, but how they are all connected by the people, by the animals, by the air, by the lands, and everyone. So thank you. And anyone who has more, please go look at our Buffalo Treaty website, their stories, buffalorelations.land. You can reach us and we can keep the conversation, because this is not the only space of conversation. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Maria, for facilitating this wonderful, wonderful panel. It was, people have been, a lot of thank you in the chats, a lot of people saying how meaningful it was. Myself, I found it very moving in many places, but then I thought of the word moving, and I thought I was able to spend time with the Buffalo and Grasslands National Park this summer, and I thought about how they move across the landscape and how they flow. So I really felt wonderful. I think being in this space with the buffalo who really were here, along with all us humans. So thank you so much to our wonderful panelists, to the participants for listening and learning and asking good questions. Thank you to the Vancouver Foundation and the Sitka Foundation, who are the financial supporters of Y2Y's Ethical Space series. And we did, of course, record the session. We record all the sessions. We will send all participants a link to the recording. You can also go to y2y.net ethical space, because all the ethical space events are up there, and there's lots of really wonderful sessions there. There's also a new film on Foundations of Ethical Space by Gwen Bridge, lots of other resources and links. We also have a short survey. We would really appreciate if people could give us some feedback. We are in an ongoing evaluation process with Reciprocal Consulting, an Indigenous-owned evaluation team out of Vancouver. So we'd really appreciate if you would take 5 minutes to do that survey if you have that time. And if you do the survey, we will enter you in a draw for a conservation-themed prize. So we are also working on one more ethical space event this fall, and that would be the Bringing the Salmon Home project. And I wanted to acknowledge Salmon Chief Mark Thomas, who was here today from the Shuswap Band. Yeah, and Tim Eugene may still be here. So please stay tuned, and we'll let you know when that is scheduled. Thank you again. Have a beautiful rest of your day. Bye-bye.
Thank you. We should explore one day. There's conversation between the salmon and the buffalo as treaties, and the families of treaties with the water is out of conversation. And I just want to say that everyone who's starting to explore their relationship to the buffalo, Wes Olson, who's here, has an amazing book that came out, The Ecological Buffalo, about all the relations with all the more than humans. It's a great gift for Christmas. Go get it, The Ecological Buffalo by Wes Olson, because you'll just start to understand the tiny pieces of all those relationships. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
Yeah.
Good seeing you again, Leroy.
Good to see you. Good to see you. Good to see you.
Candice, Kyra, are you good to leave the link open for a few minutes if someone wants us to connect?